Contrary to popular belief, a lot of really great movies came out in 2020. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. The infamous 2020 has come and gone, and now that I've had a chance to catch up on most of the year's releases, it's time for me to talk about my top 10 films of 2020. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. Despite countless delays and rescheduled releases, the film industry persevered, and we got tons of new movies in 2020. Maybe they weren't quite the ones we were hoping for, and maybe we watched them in a different setting than expected, but we actually still got a bunch of good movies, and a decent variety, with a lot of smaller independent films having an opportunity to break through to wider audiences than usual. With that being said, narrowing down and ranking my list was just as difficult as ever. So, the usual obvious disclaimers. I did not see every single movie that came out in 2020. I tried, but didn't quite make it, so this list is obviously gonna exclude movies that I haven't had a chance to see yet. I'm also a bit of a stickler when it comes to official release years for films, and this past year was a little weird with that, because we did get a few 2019 movies that didn't get official wide releases until well into 2020. So, no 2019 movies on this list. Sorry, Sound of Metal. The other thing to keep in mind is that these are just my personal top movies of the year. There are a lot of qualities that could make a movie the best, but the movies on this list are included and ranked according to how much I enjoyed them. Remember, these are just my top movies, not the top movies, so be sure to post your own personal top 10 movies of 2020 in the comments below. I've already reviewed most of these movies on this channel, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put links in the description below and also link them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this top list started. Kicking the list off, I want to briefly talk about 3 honorable mentions that didn't quite make the top 10. The first is News of the World. This movie just squeaked into 2020 with a Christmas release date, and was a really good period Western drama. It's definitely not your typical Western, and with its escort premise, it frequently feels like a road movie, just in the Old West. Tom Hanks is wonderful, as always, but his co-star, Helena Zengel, was also really good in a tricky role, because for much of the movie, her character struggles to be able to communicate with anybody. It ends up being an immersive and heartfelt drama, interspersed with moments of exciting action, all captured beautifully with probably the second best landscape cinematography of the year. The second honorable mention is The Invisible Man. This movie actually came out on my birthday, so I got to go see it in theaters with a few friends, because it was still the before times. And I gotta say, I was really impressed with this one. I've been a fan of Leigh Whannell since Saw, and I really enjoy the original 1933 Invisible Man movie, but for some reason, I didn't have all that high of expectations for this film. But man, was this a solid horror thriller. It takes the original story, modernizes it, and adds this psychological drama element that really changes the context of everything. It's got some impressive special effects and was definitely one of the most tense films of the whole year. My third honorable mention, and the film that just missed the cut, is Wolfwalkers. So I had been hearing about this movie since it premiered at TIFF. There's always that one unique non-Disney, non-Pixar animated movie that gets rave reviews every year, and this past year, Wolfwalkers was it. While I almost always enjoy these movies, they rarely live up to the hype for me, but this one did. First off, the animation style is really striking and unique. Hand-drawn 2D movies tend to visually stand out from the crowd nowadays, but I think this one does even more so than usual. The colors are extremely rich and vibrant, and it all almost feels like moving stained glass at times. And then there's a really strong story at its core. It takes a fantasy folklore approach to a sort of werewolfish story, but then goes so much deeper, mixing in themes of family, friendship, and environmentalism. Coming in at number 10, The Old Guard. I have a feeling that this is probably going to be the biggest surprise or upset on my list this year, but I had a really good time with this movie. I mean, it's not high cinema or anything, but it's a fun action film with a surprisingly interesting sci-fi story element that I personally had no idea was coming, because I hadn't watched the trailer. So I think that partly made for an even more exciting first watch for me. I really like Charlize Theron, so it was great to see her in another action role like this, and I was impressed with key sneaky lane here, too. It's easy to dismiss Netflix action movies, but I had a blast with this one, and would love to see it get a sequel. Coming in at number 9, Promising Young Woman. Even though it didn't get a release until last Christmas, this was a movie I had been interested in since late 2019. It had a promising sounding premise, and I'm pleased to say that it was actually much better than it had sounded, and even better than its intriguing trailers. This was a movie promoted based on its premise, and even though that unique premise is essential to the film, it's not all that the movie is. While I wasn't a big fan of the third act, I really did like the overall structure of the film, and the character revealing mystery of it all. It also has some excellent performances. Bo Burnham was fun in his role, but Carey Mulligan was certainly the star here, covering a lot of emotional ground to present us with a deceptively complex character. Coming in at number 8, I Care a Lot. This was such a unique and interesting story that I honestly didn't anticipate at all. I had heard a little buzz around this one following its TIFF premiere, but I didn't really know anything specific about it, so I didn't jump on it right away when it was finally released on Netflix. But man, was this an interesting movie. It's a thriller and sort of a dark comedy, but it's one of those movies where all of the characters are terrible people. In most cases, movies like that are a little tough to get into because we instinctively want to root for somebody. But this one really walks a fine line because in spite of all these characters being horrible people, they're all kinda likable in different ways, and so you can still stay invested in the story. Because of this, I imagine each person who watches this movie might root for a different side to come out on top and win, which I think is a pretty cool quality for a movie. I also can't forget to mention Rosamund Pike, who delivers a really good performance here, blurring that line between likability and unlikability. Coming in at number 7, Birds of Prey and the Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. So I have a tendency to like superhero movies more often than not, but I will say that the individual films within the DCEU haven't always been my favorites. When this movie was first announced, I didn't really have any anticipation. I knew Harley Quinn, but I had no clue who the Birds of Prey were. But I gotta say, this was probably the most fun film of 2020 for me. It's very stylized, but it embraces its comic book aesthetic, so the colors and locations and structure all work remarkably well. The fight sequences were surprisingly good, and I absolutely loved the character of Huntress. I think Black Mask was a little one note of a villain and not all that interesting beyond his eccentricities, but I would love to see another Birds of Prey movie. Maybe one that focuses a little more on the actual Birds of Prey. Coming in at number 6, Possessor. Following in the thematic and stylistic footsteps of his father, Brandon Cronenberg crafted one effective psychological sci-fi body horror here. This movie was unlike anything I had expected, based on just the name and poster alone. It's super gory and bloody, but I gotta say, the story concept was what really drew me in. It's sort of a grungy, medium-high concept sci-fi that just throws you into things before beginning to explain. It's definitely reminiscent of other sci-fi movies and gets a little too esoteric for my taste by the end, but it's a film that sucked me in and then stuck with me for quite a while after I watched it. Coming in at number 5, Run. This was such an enjoyable thriller for me. Seriously, this is the type of movie that's like tailor-made for me. It's reminiscent of both Alfred Hitchcock and Stephen King, and honestly, it steals a little bit from each of them. Certainly style-wise, but even story-wise to an extent. Run has dashes of both Rear Window and Misery in it, but it still manages to play out in a very fresh manner. I love it when the protagonist in a thriller or horror movie is actually smart and does logical or creative things to try to get themselves out of the situation. And we've got that here, along with a fairly contained story that, at only 89 minutes long, doesn't overstay its welcome. Coming in at number 4, Soul. The third Christmas release to make this list, we've got the second Pixar film of the year. It's really tough to beat Pixar when it comes to animated films. They're such a consistent studio, and their 23rd feature film is officially my favorite animated movie of the year. As seems to be the case more often than not with Pixar these days, this movie was so much better than its trailers implied. The topics and themes tackled in this movie are so deep and existential that you'd think it wouldn't really work as, arguably, a kid's movie. But in classic Pixar fashion, they somehow distilled these huge, lofty ideas into manageable and visually augmented chunks that are easy to understand and relate to. And on top of the heartfelt and soulful story, we've got some fantastic animation. It is a Pixar movie after all, and this film impressively blends very real-looking locations with warm classic character designs. Coming in at number 3, Palm Springs. I've talked about it many times in the past, but I love high-concept sci-fi. As a consequence, I'm also a complete sucker for time loop movies, so admittedly, this one had me hooked before I ever even watched it. I've been a fan of Groundhog Day for decades now, and the comparison between that and Palm Springs is inevitable, but I was really pleased by how fresh and fun this one ended up being. It takes all the typical tropes and rules of a classic time loop movie, but then tweaks them a little bit to, surprisingly, give us some things we've never seen before. Some of the humor was a bit hit or miss for me, but I found it pretty funny overall, and I really wasn't expecting it to be as heartfelt and charming as it was. It's got this deeper, more mature undercurrent to it, and it's one of those awesome movies that you can enjoy on different levels depending on how you're feeling or what type of movie you're in the mood for. Coming in at number 2, Tenet. Again, I love high-concept sci-fi. I also love Christopher Nolan's filmography, and this looked like it was going to be a blend of concepts and techniques from Inception, Interstellar, and Memento, and I was totally on board for that. This was actually probably my most anticipated movie of the year, even when I thought we were getting all of the movies. It's one of the few new releases I've seen in theaters since things started to open up again around here last summer, and I had a great time. It's not top-tier Nolan for me, but I loved working out the complexities of the story as I was watching. It's one that definitely requires your undivided attention, but I personally felt like I had a pretty good handle on the story the first time through, and it only gets more satisfying and cool on rewatch. Same goes for the action sequences, which were easily my favorite of the year. So that means my number 1 movie of 2020 is The Trial of the Chicago 7. I expected to like this movie, but I didn't expect to love it. But as soon as I finished watching it, I knew it was my favorite of the year so far, and suspected that it might not be overtaken by any movies yet to come. And it turns out, I was correct. I'm a big fan of Aaron Sorkin's writing, and based on this movie and Molly's Game, I'm also a big fan of his directing too. We hear a lot about timely movies, and while that is important, and this was a very timely movie, I think what makes a good message film is timelessness, a story and movie that can be relevantly applied in numerous contexts over time. And the true historical basis of this story certainly helps with that repeated relevancy. With Sorkin at both the typewriter and the director's chair, it should come as no surprise that the writing and dialogue is excellent. But perhaps most impressive are the performances. This is a big ensemble cast, so some characters get a good deal more screen time than others, but I think everybody put forward really strong, believable performances to help deliver this gripping story. Alright, so there you have it. Those were my top movies of 2020. It might not have been the year of movies we expected, but there were still an awful lot of great films. I've already reviewed most of these movies, so be sure to check those out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links to all of them in the description below. I do get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these 2020 movies. I'd also love to hear what your top 10 movies of 2020 were, so be sure to let me know in the comments below. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this top list, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button, and if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe there at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.